A calm reflection on belief and doubt. Part 1. There are books that are meant to be read with the eyes, and there are books that reveal their true nature only when they are heard in silence. This is not a text to be rushed through. It is not a text that asks for agreement, nor does it demand rejection. It asks only for attention. For centuries, sacred texts have shaped civilizations, guided laws, justified wars, and comforted the fearful. They have been read aloud in temples, whispered in dark rooms, and memorized by generations who were told that truth itself lived within these words. But truth, when examined closely, rarely remains simple. This work does not seek to destroy belief, nor does it aim to replace one faith with another. Instead, it pauses at a quieter place, where questions are allowed to exist without punishment, and where doubt is not treated as a crime. It invites the listener to step back, to slow down, and to observe the texts not as untouchable monuments, but as human documents shaped by history, power, fear, and interpretation. Throughout history, religious narratives have often been presented as perfectly harmonious. Yet when these narratives are placed side by side, cracks begin to appear. Different voices speak with different intentions. Different passages reflect different moral landscapes. Some verses call for peace, while others describe division. Some speak of compassion, while others normalize cruelty. The listener is left with an uncomfortable realization: harmony is often imposed after the fact, not born naturally from the text. Consider how authority is established. When a text is declared sacred, questioning it becomes dangerous. Interpretation is no longer an intellectual act, it becomes an act of loyalty. Over time, the meaning of words hardens, not because they are clear, but because they are protected. What began as storytelling slowly transforms into doctrine. Doctrine becomes law. Law becomes power. And power, once established, rarely tolerates ambiguity. Many sacred narratives contain scenes that, if removed from their religious framing, would shock the modern conscience. Stories of violence justified by divine will. Commands that normalize inequality. Words attributed to revered figures that promote division rather than unity. These passages are often explained away, softened, or hidden behind theological language. But explanation is not the same as resolution. When a listener hears these stories without the protective shield of tradition, something changes. The words feel heavier. The moral weight shifts. The mind begins to ask questions it was never encouraged to ask. Why is suffering praised in some passages and condemned in others? Why are certain groups elevated while others are dismissed or dehumanized? Why is obedience valued more than understanding? These are not modern questions imposed on ancient texts. They are questions that have always existed, quietly, in the minds of those who listened carefully. It is important to understand that religious texts were not written in a vacuum. They emerged from specific historical conditions, times of war, exile, political struggle, and cultural conflict. Fear shaped theology as much as faith did. Survival influenced doctrine as strongly as revelation. When these texts are read without acknowledging their context, they appear timeless. When context is restored, they appear human. And humanity, while capable of beauty, is also capable of contradiction. Throughout this work, familiar stories will be revisited. Not to mock them, not to sensationalize them, but to place them under a calm, steady light. The intention is not to shout, but to speak softly, because soft voices often travel farther in the dark. You may notice that the language feels different from traditional religious readings. That is intentional. The rhythm is slower. The tone is reflective. This is not a sermon. It is closer to a quiet conversation held late at night, when defenses are lower and honesty feels safer. As you listen, you may feel discomfort. That is not failure. Discomfort is often the first sign that a long-ignored thought has finally been given permission to surface. You may also feel moments of clarity, brief realizations where things suddenly align. Do not hold on to them too tightly. Let them pass, just as questions pass. Belief, when it is sincere, should not fear examination. And doubt, when it is honest, is not an enemy of truth. This journey will move through stories that are often treated as unquestionable. It will highlight inconsistencies not as accusations, but as observations. It will show how different voices, written at different times, were later bound together and presented as a single, unified message. And it will ask a simple but powerful question: what happens when we listen without assuming the answer in advance? There is no requirement here to abandon belief. Nor is there a demand to adopt disbelief. The purpose is awareness. Awareness of how narratives are constructed. Awareness of how authority is preserved. Awareness of how sacred language can be used to comfort, or to control. In the quiet moments before sleep, the mind is unusually open. It wanders freely, no longer guarded by the urgency of daylight. That is why this text belongs here, in these moments. Not to disturb rest, but to accompany it. Not to command thought, but to gently invite it. As this exploration continues, stories will unfold slowly. Contradictions will appear naturally. Interpretations will be questioned without hostility. And through it all, the tone will remain steady, calm, and deliberate. This is not a battle against faith. It is an invitation to understanding. And understanding, unlike belief, does not require silence. Part 2. When sacred stories are repeated often enough, they begin to feel inevitable. Not because they are beyond question, but because familiarity creates comfort. The words settle into memory, and memory slowly replaces understanding. Over time, repetition becomes truth, not through evidence, but through habit. One of the most powerful tools in any belief system is selective emphasis. Certain passages are elevated, repeated, framed as central. Others are quietly ignored, explained away, or labeled as symbolic when they become inconvenient. In this way, a text that contains multiple, often conflicting voices can be presented as speaking with only one. Yet when the text is read slowly, without guidance, another pattern emerges. Statements attributed to the same figure may pull in opposite directions. Compassion and severity coexist. Peace and division stand side by side. The listener begins to realize that consistency is not inherent, it is constructed. There are moments where revered figures speak words that fracture families, praise separation, or redefine loyalty in unsettling ways. In these passages, devotion is measured not by kindness, but by the willingness to abandon even one's closest relationships. Love becomes conditional. Allegiance replaces empathy. Such ideas are rarely emphasized in public readings. When they are encountered, they are surrounded by commentary, softened by interpretation, or framed as metaphor. But metaphor does not erase meaning. It merely postpones confrontation. Another recurring theme is obedience. Obedience to authority. Obedience to doctrine. Obedience even when understanding is absent. Questioning is not encouraged, trust is. And trust, when detached from critical thought, becomes submission. Throughout history, submission has been presented as virtue. Suffering has been romanticized. Endurance of injustice has been reframed as spiritual strength. Those who accept hardship without resistance are praised, while those who challenge it are often portrayed as rebellious or faithless. This framing serves a function. It stabilizes hierarchies. It protects power. It teaches people not only what to believe, but how to behave. When moral responsibility is shifted upward, toward divine command, human accountability weakens. Actions that would otherwise be condemned become permissible if they are presented as obedience. Violence becomes righteous. Discrimination becomes duty. Silence becomes holiness. In some narratives, entire groups are described in degrading terms, reduced to animals or objects. These descriptions are not subtle. They are explicit. Yet they are rarely confronted directly. Instead, they are contextualized until their emotional impact fades. The listener is encouraged to look past the language, rather than through it. But language matters. Words shape perception. Repeated descriptions become internalized beliefs. And beliefs, once normalized, influence behavior far beyond the text itself. Another striking pattern is the treatment of women, the poor, and the powerless. Their worth is often conditional. Their roles narrowly defined. Their voice is largely absent. When they do appear, they are frequently used as moral symbols rather than fully realized individuals. Meanwhile, figures of authority are granted extraordinary moral flexibility. Their actions, regardless of severity, are often framed as necessary, justified, or divinely sanctioned. Standards are not applied equally. Power reshapes morality. This imbalance is not accidental. It reflects the societies in which these texts were written, societies structured around hierarchy, dominance, and survival. Sacred language did not emerge outside these realities, it absorbed them. As texts were compiled, edited, and preserved, choices were made. Some writings were included. Others were excluded. Some voices were amplified. Others were silenced. What remains is not a neutral record, but a curated collection shaped by theological, political, and institutional interests. Over centuries, this collection gained authority not because it was flawless, but because it was protected. Once protection becomes sacred, critique becomes taboo. Yet critique is not destruction. To examine is not to attack. To question is not to deny meaning. On the contrary, honest examination is often the deepest form of respect we can offer any text. What happens when a listener allows themselves to hear these narratives without inherited explanations? When familiar phrases are stripped of ceremony and heard as plain language? Often, what emerges is not clarity, but complexity. And complexity is uncomfortable. It resists slogans. It disrupts certainty. It demands patience. But complexity also honors reality. Real human experience is contradictory. Real moral reflection is rarely absolute. When sacred texts deny this complexity, they do not elevate humanity, they simplify it. In quiet moments, when the noise of certainty fades, the mind naturally begins to explore these tensions. Not to resolve them, but to acknowledge them. And acknowledgement alone can be transformative. This exploration does not promise answers. It offers perspective. It does not ask the listener to replace one belief with another. It asks only that belief be held with awareness. As the journey continues, specific stories will surface. Words often repeated without pause will be slowed down. Familiar passages will be heard without commentary. And in that space, between word and interpretation, new understanding may emerge. Not loud. Not forceful. But steady. Part 3. As the stories continue, a subtle transformation takes place, not within the text itself, but within the listener. What once sounded familiar now carries weight. What once felt unquestionable begins to breathe. This is not because the words have changed, but because attention has. Attention is powerful. When it is patient, it reveals layers that speed conceals. Many sacred narratives rely on urgency. They are meant to be accepted quickly, absorbed early, before doubt has time to form. Childhood is often the ideal moment. When belief is introduced before critical language develops, it settles deeply, anchoring itself to identity rather than reason. Later, questioning feels like betrayal, not inquiry. In this way, belief becomes personal long before it becomes understood. As adults revisit these texts, they rarely encounter them freely. They are surrounded by inherited interpretations, institutional explanations, and emotional consequences. The text is no longer just a collection of words, it is family, culture, history, and belonging. To question the text feels like questioning oneself. This emotional fusion makes neutrality difficult. Yet neutrality is precisely what allows observation without fear. When sacred figures speak harshly, when they condemn rather than comfort, the listener is often taught to reinterpret tone. Severity is framed as love. Threats are reframed as concern. Punishment becomes protection. Over time, the line between care and control blurs. But language has texture. It carries emotional intent. When listened to carefully, without defensive explanation, tone becomes audible again. Some passages demand unquestioning loyalty, even at the cost of compassion. Others frame suffering as virtue, portraying endurance as proof of devotion. In these moments, resistance is not portrayed as strength, but as failure. Submission becomes the highest moral achievement. This narrative has consequences. It teaches people to tolerate injustice, to spiritualize pain, and to distrust their own moral instincts. When suffering is glorified, empathy is dulled. When obedience is rewarded, conscience is silenced. Another recurring pattern is fear, subtle but persistent. Fear of punishment. Fear of exclusion. Fear of being wrong. Fear of eternal consequences. Fear is rarely explicit, it is woven gently into the background, shaping behavior without announcing itself. Fear is effective because it feels protective. It promises safety in exchange for compliance. And once accepted, it becomes difficult to recognize as fear at all. Alongside fear, there is promise. Promise of reward. Promise of meaning. Promise of belonging. These promises are powerful motivators, especially in uncertain times. They offer structure in chaos, answers in confusion, identity in isolation. Yet promises tied to obedience come at a cost. They narrow acceptable thought. They define virtue not by action, but by alignment. They transform moral questions into loyalty tests. As sacred texts moved from oral tradition to written form, and later into institutional doctrine, this structure solidified. What may have once been fluid narratives became fixed commands. What may have once invited reflection became mandates. The listener may begin to notice how often moral responsibility is deferred. Decisions are justified not by reasoning, but by reference. It is written replaces it as right. In such a framework, ethics become external. Accountability dissolves upward. History offers many examples of how this dynamic unfolds. When authority claims divine endorsement, opposition becomes heresy. Debate becomes rebellion. Silence becomes survival. And yet, within these same texts, there are moments of tenderness. Moments of compassion. Moments that recognize human fragility and offer understanding rather than judgment. These moments feel different. They breathe. They resonate. The presence of both cruelty and kindness within the same collection reveals something essential: these texts are not singular voices. They are echoes of many minds, many eras, many struggles. To insist on perfect unity is to deny their humanity. Unity, when forced, erases nuance. It simplifies complexity. It trades honesty for harmony. In this quiet listening space, harmony is not required. Contradiction is allowed to exist. A passage does not need to cancel another to be acknowledged. Both can be held, examined, and questioned. This approach does not weaken understanding, it deepens it. As you listen, you may notice moments where your attention drifts. That is natural. Let it drift. Let the words continue softly in the background. Meaning does not always arrive through focus. Sometimes it arrives through repetition, through rhythm, through calm exposure. There is no urgency here. No conclusion waiting at the end. This is not a path toward certainty, but toward awareness. And awareness does not demand belief or disbelief. It asks only that you see clearly. Part 4. As the narrative deepens, another layer becomes visible, not in what is said, but in what is normalized. Certain ideas are repeated so frequently that they stop sounding like ideas at all. They become assumptions. Foundations. Things that are no longer examined because they are no longer noticed. One of these assumptions is hierarchy. Sacred narratives often place order above empathy. Roles are clearly defined. Authority flows in one direction. Obedience is praised not as a practical necessity, but as a moral ideal. Those at the top speak with certainty. Those below are expected to listen, accept, and endure. This structure is rarely questioned within the text itself. When it is, the challenge is often framed as dangerous, misguided, or sinful. Authority is protected not through persuasion, but through sanctification. When power becomes sacred, accountability disappears. In many passages, figures of authority commit acts that would otherwise provoke moral outrage. Violence, deception, exclusion, and domination are justified by divine alignment. The moral standard shifts depending on who is acting and under what banner. What is forbidden to the many becomes permissible for the few. This selective morality is not subtle. It appears openly, yet is rarely addressed directly. Instead, it is absorbed quietly, becoming part of the ethical landscape the listener grows accustomed to. Over time, this landscape shapes perception. It teaches that morality is not universal, but positional. That right and wrong depend not on action, but on status. That power can redefine virtue. Another normalized idea is sacrifice. Sacrifice is praised endlessly, but rarely examined. Giving up comfort. Giving up autonomy. Giving up joy. Even giving up one's own moral instincts. Sacrifice is framed as noble, purifying, and necessary. Yet sacrifice without consent is not virtue, it is loss. When individuals are taught to surrender themselves completely, their inner voice grows faint. Desires are mistrusted. Boundaries are ignored. Identity dissolves into obedience. The self becomes something to overcome, rather than something to understand. This erasure of self is often celebrated as humility. But humility that demands silence is not humility, it is submission. Throughout history, such teachings have proven useful. They produce compliant communities. They discourage resistance. They frame suffering as destiny rather than injustice. And once suffering is spiritualized, change becomes unnecessary. The listener may notice how often hope is displaced into the future. Reward is postponed. Justice is deferred. Relief is promised later, elsewhere, beyond reach. The present becomes something to endure rather than improve. This future-oriented hope can be comforting, but it can also be controlling. When fulfillment is always postponed, dissatisfaction loses its power. Anger becomes impatience. Protest becomes doubt. In this way, narratives do not merely describe reality, they manage it. Yet even within these controlling structures, there are cracks. Moments where compassion interrupts command. Where mercy softens law. Where humanity surfaces despite doctrine. These moments feel different because they are different. They resist systemization. They feel alive. It is often these moments that listeners remember most vividly. Not the threats. Not the hierarchies. But the brief gestures of understanding that cut through rigidity. These gestures remind us that morality is not born from obedience, but from awareness. As texts are read aloud, especially in quiet moments like these, something subtle happens. The listener begins to distinguish between voice and message. Between authority and wisdom. Between command and insight. This distinction is crucial. Authority demands agreement. Wisdom invites reflection. Many sacred traditions conflate the two. They teach that questioning authority is the same as rejecting wisdom. But wisdom does not fear examination. It grows stronger through it. As this listening continues, you may find yourself holding opposing thoughts simultaneously. Respect alongside skepticism. Curiosity alongside caution. This is not confusion. It is complexity. Complexity does not weaken understanding. It refines it. There is no need to resolve these tensions immediately. Let them coexist. Let them breathe. Understanding unfolds slowly, often beneath conscious awareness. In the stillness of listening, without pressure to conclude, the mind reorganizes itself. Old assumptions loosen. New questions form quietly. And without force, perspective shifts. This is not transformation through persuasion. It is transformation through attention. Part 5. As the mind settles further into the rhythm of listening, another realization begins to surface, one that is easy to overlook in louder conversations. Much of what is considered sacred is not defined by what it reveals, but by what it protects. Protection is not always visible. Sometimes it appears as reverence. Sometimes as tradition. Sometimes as fear disguised as respect. Sacred narratives often claim timelessness, yet they carry the fingerprints of their time everywhere. Social structures, gender roles, economic realities, and political anxieties are woven into the language. When these elements are treated as eternal truths rather than historical conditions, the past quietly governs the present. This is how tradition becomes authority. Over generations, stories that once reflected survival strategies are transformed into moral absolutes. Rules shaped by scarcity are presented as universal virtues. Power arrangements born from conflict are framed as divine order. What began as adaptation hardens into commandment. The listener may notice how often moral instruction is framed negatively, not by what one should become, but by what one must avoid. Fear of error outweighs curiosity. Avoidance replaces understanding. In such frameworks, morality is less about growth and more about containment. Containment of thought. Containment of behavior. Containment of identity. This containment is often justified as protection of purity. Purity of belief. Purity of community. Purity of intention. Yet purity, when strictly enforced, creates distance. It divides. It categorizes. It ranks. Those who belong are reassured. Those who differ are warned. Those who resist are excluded. Exclusion does not always appear violent. Often it is quiet. Subtle. A change in tone. A withdrawal of belonging. A shift from we to they. These linguistic boundaries shape emotional reality long before physical boundaries are drawn. Another pattern emerges in the way doubt is treated. Doubt is rarely engaged with honestly. Instead, it is pathologized. It is framed as weakness, temptation, or moral failure. The doubter is not seen as curious, but as dangerous. This framing discourages introspection. It teaches individuals to suppress questions rather than explore them. Over time, this suppression becomes automatic. The mind learns to redirect itself before curiosity fully forms. But suppressed questions do not disappear. They settle beneath the surface, shaping unease, guilt, or quiet resentment. What is not allowed expression often finds other ways to speak. In the stillness of night, when external expectations fade, these questions sometimes return. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just as a gentle discomfort. A sense that something does not align. It is here, precisely here, that careful listening matters most. When sacred texts are approached without the demand to agree, they reveal something unexpected. Not coherence, but struggle. Not perfection, but negotiation. Different authors grappling with different realities, trying to impose order on uncertainty. This does not diminish their significance. It humanizes it. Human attempts to explain existence are always incomplete. They reflect hope as much as fear. Aspiration as much as limitation. When these attempts are frozen into absolutes, they lose their humility. Humility is often misunderstood. It is not silence. It is not obedience. True humility acknowledges uncertainty. It recognizes the limits of knowledge. It allows space for revision. Texts that forbid revision do not protect truth. They protect authority. As listening continues, you may find yourself less interested in conclusions and more attentive to patterns. Less focused on answers and more aware of mechanisms. How meaning is constructed. How loyalty is cultivated. How dissent is discouraged. This shift is subtle, but profound. Understanding does not arrive as a dramatic revelation. It arrives as a quiet reorientation. A gradual loosening of inherited certainty. A willingness to sit with unanswered questions without anxiety. In this space, belief, if it remains, becomes gentler. Less defensive. More reflective. And disbelief, if it emerges, does not need to be hostile. It can be calm. Respectful. Honest. The goal is not replacement. It is awareness. As the narrative continues, attention will move closer to specific themes, authority, morality, suffering, and control, not as accusations, but as observations. not to provoke reaction, but to invite reflection. For now, allow the words to remain with you lightly. There is nothing to grasp, nothing to resolve. Just listening,